From the moment that the Japanese bombers appeared over Oahu, that was what came to thousands of minds of Japanese American and Japanese residents in Hawaii. One of the things I tried to do with the book is we've all seen Pearl Harbor in films and various depictions, but I really wanted to look at that event through the eyes of Japanese Americans. For that very reason, when they saw the emblem of the rising sun on the underwings of those aircraft, they knew instantaneously that they had a challenge ahead of them, that they were going to, in some sense or another, have to decide where their allegiance lay.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this event in American Stories Inspiration Today, the author series presented as a partnership among American Ancestors, New England Historic Genealogical Society, the Boston Public Library, and GBH Forum Network. Tonight, we're glad to welcome as well the Japan Society of Boston. I'm Margaret Talcott, the producer of literary programs at American Ancestors NEHGS and part of its Brew Family Learning Center. All of us behind the scenes are delighted you're with us in the land of American history, exploring our country at war and at peace, and most poignantly, the immigrant experience. On your screen is a schedule for our hour-long event featuring the #1 New York Times bestselling author, Daniel James Brown, and his just-released book, Facing the Mountain, a true story of Japanese American heroes in World War II.
Thank you, Margaret. I'm Kristen Motti, a programs librarian at the Boston Public Library. Thank you all for joining us and our partners for this conversation this evening with Daniel James Brown and Roland Nozomu Kelts. If you'd like to buy a signed copy of Facing the Mountain with free media mail shipping, please visit our partners Porter Square Books. The information is going to be put in the chat periodically throughout the program. Or check your local public library and get your copy through your library.
Thank you so much, Kristen. I am a huge fan of our guest tonight, and it's a real honor to do this introduction. Daniel James Brown is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of The Boys in the Boat, 9 Americans and Their Epic Quest for Gold at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. That great work spent over 135 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. Daniel also wrote The Indifferent Stars Above, the harrowing saga of the Donner Party, and Under a Flamingo Sky, the Great Hinckley Firestorm of 1894. His works have won multiple awards. In a more casual bio that I found, Daniel said he loves to read about American history and that his primary interest as a writer is in bringing compelling historical events to life as vividly and accurately as possible. Mission accomplished indeed. Daniel has taught writing at San Jose State and Stanford universities. He lives in the farmland near Seattle, and he is zooming in from there tonight. Before we meet him, though, and hear from him, he's got a wonderful presentation for us, some information about our guest moderator and tonight's partnership with the Japan Society of Boston. Yuko, over to you.
Thank you, Margaret. A warm welcome to the event tonight from the Japan Society of Boston. It is a great pleasure to co-present this important and wonderful work by Mr. Brown. I had the opportunity to read Facing the Mountain ahead of time, and I will be honest, at times it was not an easy read. World War II can be a painful past, but reading Facing the Mountain has strengthened my commitment to the work we do at the Japan Society of Boston, building a community of bridge builders to make sure a world dedicated to understanding and respect for the dignity of all people emerge from our past. Thank you, Mr. Brown, for this wonderful work. Today, I also have the great honor to introduce our moderator of the night, a close friend of the Japan Society of Boston, Roland Kelts. Author Roland Kelts is a Tokyo-based Japanese-American writer, editor, and scholar. His first book, Japan America, How Japanese Pop Culture Has Invaded the US, is a required reading for many Hollywood producers, artists, academics, and fans worldwide. He contributes to the New Yorker, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Guardian, the Nikkei, and other publications in the US, Europe, and Japan, and is a primary source on Japanese culture for CNN, the BBC, the CBC, and NHK. He has interviewed Hayao Miyazaki, Haruki Murakami, and Yoko Ono, among others, and is also a professor at Waseda University in Tokyo. He'll join us from Tokyo following Mr. Brown's brief presentation.
Thanks so much for having me, and good evening, everybody. I thought I'd start by talking a little bit about how and why I decided to write this book. 5.5 years ago, I met a gentleman named Tom Ikeda. Tom has, for the last 25 years, been running a project in Seattle called the Densho Project. He's been collecting, recording, videotaping, archiving, curating, and making available the oral histories of Japanese Americans, mostly from the World War II era. And I met Tom actually at an awards ceremony. But after that ceremony, I went home and I dove into Densho's online collection of oral histories. And I was just mesmerized by many of the stories that I was hearing. These were the kinds of stories that I like. They were all about Japanese Americans, but they were also stories of people, ordinary people overcoming great odds, people pulling together, people enduring difficult times, but prevailing in the end. So I found many of those stories absolutely mesmerizing. And I, in fairly short order, decided, after talking a lot to Tom and beginning to talk to the family members of some of the men who he interviewed, I decided I would really like to try to write a book that captured some of this, but I didn't want to write a comprehensive history of Japanese Americans. For one thing, I'd just be very presumptuous on my part. And it's not what I do. I write stories about individuals, personal stories that I hope shed light on history and help educate folks about a particular slice of history. So what I wound up doing in order to sort of narrow the topic down was I realized that right after the attack on Pearl Harbor, young Nisei men, Japanese men, American men of draft age, faced a terrible dilemma. In early 1942, their families were being incarcerated. Many of them were being incarcerated. Their parents' businesses had been ruined. Their land had been taken away from them. They were enduring racist epithets from all directions. But at the same time, millions of their fellow young Americans were wanting to sign up to serve in the military. So what were they to do? They had some really difficult decisions to make about how to conduct themselves in this sort of moment of dilemma that the beginning of World War II posed for them. So I wound up focusing on 4 individual young men, drawn mostly from the Densho archives, but also from some other archives. And I wound up listening to hundreds of hours of oral histories, both by these 4 individuals and family members, and then talking to their families. And so what I think I'd like to do is just take a few minutes to sort of briefly introduce you to each of these 4 individuals, as sort of give a 1-minute biography so you can get a sense of who they were. This book as a whole, as an overall structure, weaves together not just their individual stories, but the stories of their immigrant families, how they coped with the beginning of the war, how they coped with incarceration. Some of these young men did wind up serving in the American military, how they dealt with that, how others resisted it. And so sort of the whole fabric of the experience as demonstrated by these 4 guys. So let me bring up a slide of the first young man. This is Gordon Hirabayashi. This is, as you can see, on his wedding day, and just a few days before he was sent off to federal prison. Gordon was a student at the University of Washington when the war broke out. He was a conscientious objector and a Quaker. And he was also a young man with extremely strong principles and an unusual ability to articulate those principles. One of the things that happened immediately after Pearl Harbor in those first couple months of 1942 was that in Seattle and many other cities, curfews were imposed on anyone of Japanese descent. Gordon defied that curfew openly, and he actually kept a journal recording his defiance of it so that he could demonstrate that he had deliberately defied it. And then when the time came for Japanese Americans in Seattle to be put on buses and taken away to camps around the American West, Gordon refused to get on the bus. Instead, he sat down and he wrote a very detailed, thoughtful statement about why he was resisting both incarceration in the camps and the curfew. He wrote that statement out, he addressed it to the FBI, he went downtown Seattle, handed the statement to the FBI, and turned himself in. And that began what turned out to be a legal battle that went on through the whole war. Gordon wound up incarcerated at the King County Jail, then in a work camp in Arizona, and finally in a federal prison. But his case wound up at the US Supreme Court. And in the long run, after Gordon had passed away much later, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his principled stand against the incarcerations. The next young man, if we could bring up the slide of Katz Miho, was Katsugo was his full name, nickname was Katz. Katz was born and raised on the Hawaiian island of Maui at a time when Maui, like all the Hawaiian islands, were run largely as sugarcane and pineapple plantations. A very brutal system, very racially stratified and segregated, particularly first generation Japanese immigrants were exploited terribly by the plantation system. Katz's family owned and ran a small hotel on Maui, but when Pearl Harbor happened, he was a student at the University of Hawaii in Honolulu. He witnessed the bombing of Pearl Harbor from the roof of his residence hall. And because he was a member of the University of Hawaii's ROTC, he was enlisted immediately that afternoon into a thing called the Hawaii Territorial Guard. So that evening, the evening of the bombing, he found himself on the waterfront down in Honolulu, patrolling against what everybody expected would be a Japanese invasion at any moment. As he was patrolling the waterfront, though, what he didn't know was that his father was being taken into custody at the family hotel and would spend the rest of the war in a DOJ prison camp on the mainland. And then the third young man, Fred Shiosaki. Fred grew up in Spokane, Washington, actually in a neighborhood called Hilliard, which was a pretty tough part of town. It was a neighborhood of mostly immigrants, not just Japanese immigrants, but Norwegians and Germans and all sorts of immigrants. It was a tough neighborhood and a lot of ethnic slurs got thrown around. And Fred, although he was intrinsically a very gentle, soft-spoken young man, he learned early on to fight. He didn't like to fight. He was a man who did not like to fight, but he would not abide racial slurs. And so he actually got in many fistfights and often came home with his glasses broken so often that his father was in despair because he had to keep buying Fred new pairs of eyeglasses. Fred wound up eventually enlisting in what was called the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Initially, Japanese Americans were not allowed to enlist in the US Army. But in 1943, the Roosevelt administration reversed course and created an all-volunteer, all-Japanese American fighting unit that went on to have a very, very distinguished record during the war. Fred had tried to enlist right after Pearl Harbor. He was refused because he was Japanese American. But when the 442nd was created, he did enlist. and he fought in what was called K Company. Alongside this next young man, Rudi Tokiwa. This is Rudi in the front of the formation here, leading some captured Germans in out of the field in northern Italy during the war. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team served in Italy, then in France and Germany, and then back in Italy at the end of the war. Rudi was quite a character. He got in trouble a lot. His army name was Punch Drunk because he was often got in squabbles and broke some rules, but he had an absolutely huge heart. And I think readers are going to really enjoy coming to know Rudi. He saw heavy fighting in the war, was wounded, and actually later in life wound up in an iron lung as a result of some of those wounds. So the story in many ways culminates at what's called the Battle for the Lost Battalion. In the fall of 1944, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team was fighting in northern France right along the German border, alongside a number of other units, all white Caucasian units. In the course of that siege, as they attempted to cross the German border, the commanding general ordered a unit of Texas soldiers, a Texas division, out into the Vosges forest beyond really where he should have asked them to go. They were cut off, surrounded by German troops, and for days were stuck up at the end of this long ridge line. These Texans were dying of gangrene and other wounds. They had run out of food and water. The commanding general sent one unit after another up to try to rescue them. None of them could get through until finally he called on the all Japanese American 442nd Regimental Combat Team and sent them up into the mountains to try to reach the Texans. And I wanted to show you this photo because it shows these are some of the survivors of that battle. And if you ever get a chance to look at this photo and zoom in on it, you'll see the absolutely stunned look in the eyes of these young men. So that is just one part of the story. There are many other components to it, but in the end, it's a story of courage more than anything else. And not just the courage that these young soldiers showed on the battlefield, but different dimensions of courage, including the courage of somebody like Gordon Hirabayashi, who stood up to the authorities and defied the curfew and the exclusion laws, and the courage of the family members who stood by these young men, whether they were fighting in courtrooms or fighting overseas in Italy, France, and Germany. So that's a very brief snapshot of the book, but I think we're going to have Roland come online now, and he's got some questions for me, so we can go through those.
Thank you, Daniel, and ohayo gozaimasu. Good morning from Tokyo. It's an honor to be here, and it's a pleasure to be together with Daniel at this event. I'm a big fan of his work, and this new book I think is both powerful and very important, in particular as it lands in a time of conflict in the United States and unfortunately around the world. I want to start, Daniel, by asking you a question, a sort of a broad question that you alluded to in your introduction, which is, as I was reading the book, I kept thinking about this concept of allegiance. To whom we owe our allegiance as individuals, as residents of a country, as citizens of a country. And I think it's, as I was reading, I thought it's a question that most of us don't have to face, unless, of course, we're faced with the kinds of tragic conflicts or circumstances that confront the characters in your book, the people in your book. And, you know, I thought about this quote early on in the book, which is quite heartbreaking. Akiji Yoshimura says he feels deep anguish and despair because the land I had been taught to honor by my parents had committed an act of war against the country that I loved. And, that takes on sort of Shakespearean dimensions, that how are you going to decide to whom you owe your allegiance at a point of crisis when you're forced to make that decision? And I guess I would put that to you, Daniel, first. Like, how did you wrestle with that question? And I suppose coming away from all the research that you did in this book, to whom does one owe allegiance in your mind?
It's a really good question and a really potent question. And yes, from the moment that the Japanese bombers appeared over Oahu, that was what came to thousands of minds, Japanese American and Japanese residents in Hawaii. One of the things I tried to do with the book is we've all seen Pearl Harbor in films and various depictions, but I really wanted to look at that event through the eyes of Japanese Americans. For that very reason, when they saw the emblem of the rising sun on the underwings of those aircraft, they knew instantaneously that they had a challenge ahead of them, that they were going to, in some sense or another, have to decide where their allegiance lay. And for many of them, their parents, frankly, their allegiance was pretty much baked in. Many of their parents were, in fact, devoted to the emperor and to the cause of Japan. So what did that mean for these young men? Were they going to break not only with the country from which they had their parents had come, but their parents themselves? And so conflicts arose within families, as I'm sure you are aware, over these conflicted loyalties. So it's a metaphysical question. It's a huge problem, and I'm not sure I have a pat answer for it. I think your allegiance probably in the end has to lie with what you think is right. And I think for a lot of the young Japanese American men who did volunteer for the military, particularly, they decided that the right thing to do was to fight for the country in which they had been born and the ideals that that country represented, democratic ideals, basically.
Which is, of course, played out in the characters you address. I mean, you have these four men, one of whom is a resistor, Gordon Hirabayashi, and that really sort of highlights a conflict in the book that I think, particularly for readers like myself who have experiences in Japan. My mother is Japanese, so I have a Japanese family, and I've lived in Japan for close to 20 years now. And you address this conflict within the Japanese American community at the camps. And some of you may know, in Japanese culture and a lot of Asian cultures, there's this concept of shame, which is quite different than the way it's often perceived in the West, and certainly in the United States. And so the idea of talking about this conflict between those who readily volunteered to go fight for the United States and to defend those constitutional principles, and those who resisted because, in fact, the United States had incarcerated them and their families and disenfranchised them, taken away their livelihoods, their businesses, and in many ways their dignity.
Yeah.
And I wonder, Daniel, how you were able to get, first of all, people talking about this conflict within the Japanese American community, and how that may have affected the way you told the story. Because, the typical approach is that these people were all bonded, they stuck together, they fought through it, and that's noble in a sense, and it is part of the story. Mm-hmm. But there's also this deep conflict within generations and within the camp.
Yeah, and it was very evident to me, as I dove into the subject. And really, I owe Densho on the collection of oral histories there for whatever insight I was able to gain into that. But it became quite evident as I listened to so many different voices of Nisei men in particular, that there was not a unified view of what had happened or what should have happened even. There were many different views, but they basically split into two large divisions, which were those who adamantly believed that the right thing to do was to to go off to camps, to suffer nobly, to be as American as they could, and so on and so forth, on the one hand, and to serve in the military if they got the chance. And on the other hand, though, to resist with every being part of their fabric that they could summon up. And, you know, Gordon, I chose to focus on Gordon as a resistor, partly because he's so well documented and he based his arguments so much on carefully laid out principles. But there were also many, many, many young men within the camps in particular, particularly at Heart Mountain and Tule Lake, who resisted ferociously and did not want to cooperate with the War Relocation Authority or the military in any way at all. So it was just, you know, hearing all these different voices, it revealed to me how complex the situation was. And that's part of what made it interesting to me. As I say, the sort of impetus, the spring behind the book is dilemmas are always a good thing for a storyteller. And here was this sort of existential dilemma that these young men faced, and that their families were affected by it. Of course, it wasn't just the young men, it was their mothers and their sisters and all their relatives who were deeply affected by this.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to mention here that we are accepting questions from the audience as well. And if you're watching this and this is giving rise to questions you might have for Daniel or for me about this topic or these issues, please type them into the Q&A or the chat section here. I want to also mention here that, first of all, Daniel's book covers a lot of ground, not just historically, but geographically. It takes place largely on the West Coast and the western part of the United States, where Japanese Americans were incarcerated in the camps, but also in the southern part of the United States, as he follows the troops to their boot camps and so on as they're training, but across the Atlantic in the European front, also to Hawaii, where a number of the soldiers came from, and all the way to Japan, right here in Japan, where he follows one of the sisters of one of the men, Fumie Miho, who comes to Japan as a Japanese American and experiences the war on that side. So it's quite an extraordinary vision. The book really covers a lot of ground. And one of the unfortunately, one of the very timely matters in the book is this question of prejudice, and particularly that directed against Asian Americans. And as we know, in the US, there's been a rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans recently in the country. And I guess I wanted to sort of look at that issue through the prism of your book, Daniel. You note a sort of piercing segment of the book as you're following the soldiers as they're training in the South, that German Americans and Italian Americans, even though those nations were considered obviously direct enemies of the United States, they were not treated to the same humiliations and to the incarceration that the Japanese Americans faced. And obviously it raises this question about whether race itself and the exoticism that some humans apply to racial matters can kind of overtake any questions of justice or dignity. And I wonder, you know, in your case, Daniel, you've written about Americans, you've written about history in the past, but here you're really confronting the issue of race, it seems to me, head on in your story. Could you talk a little bit about that, how that affected your experience as a writer?
Yeah, I mean, it became very obvious right away as I was just started doing basic historical research that the basis on which Japanese Americans were sent to what were essentially concentration camps and discriminated against in the particular way that they were was based entirely on race. The fact that, you know, German and Italian Americans looked more or less like a lot of other white Americans, to a large extent, it insulated them from the kinds of prejudice that that Japanese Americans did simply because they were Asian. And so, you know, I grew up in California on the West Coast, so I thought I had a pretty good understanding of the roots of anti-Asian sentiment. But really, it was kind of eye-opening when I began to do the historical research, going back to the 19th century, to actually the gold rush, and the period right after the gold rush, when Chinese immigrants were coming to the gold fields, and there were beatings and lynchings and burnings and people being driven out of town, and this horrible violence that was unleashed against first Chinese immigrants, and then waves of Japanese immigrants that came later. And this period that they called the Yellow Peril in the late 19th, early 20th century, there arose all these vicious tropes and images and associations equating Asians with rodents and vermin and plagues and disease. And I had known that in an abstract sense, but I really hadn't realized the depth of it until I did this research. And then what was so obvious was that right after Pearl Harbor, all those images and tropes and associations were already at hand in the American consciousness. And so they all got pulled up and recycled and used again, in this wave of anger that followed Pearl Harbor. But they were developed much earlier, and they were already there. And what's happened recently in this country is really the same thing. They're being pulled up again. They're the same racist, vile images and associations that have been there since the 19th century.
On a more optimistic note, perhaps more positive note, you really in depth tell the story of the 442nd unit, the soldiers who really are in one of the most decorated units in U.S. military history. It's not just brave, but actually honored for their bravery. And the 100th unit, which also contained Japanese American soldiers. It's a fairly broad question, but Danielle, I wonder if you could talk about the heroism that you addressed in the story, and also as a writer, how you were able to get, in some cases I did double takes because it was like minute by minute accounts of what the men were experiencing on the ground, on these hillsides and in the dirt and the mud, and what they ate that evening, and whether or not they had indigestion. Can you talk a little bit about the unit and also how you got all these stories? Yeah,
so it was an incredibly cohesive and effective fighting force. Let's just say that for starters. They suffered enormous casualties, but they won a disproportionate number of honors in the war for this sheer audacity and bravery. For one thing, these guys were always fighting their way up the side of some mountain or another. In Italy, on the French-German border, and then back in northern Italy again, they were always fighting uphill against the Germans, who were always on top of the hill shooting down. And so they were always charging uphill into ferocious fire and just extremely disadvantageous fighting conditions, which is part of their legacy and part of why we recognize them as courageous as they were. The way I was able to sort of capture a lot of that in granular detail was, again, due largely to the collection at Densho, and also talking to family members of the particular guys I was writing about. But for instance, this rescue of the Lost Battalion battle, that's sort of the climax of the story in many ways. Fred Shiosaki was there and Rudi Tokiwa was there. But there were a couple hundred other guys there, and quite a few of them have left oral histories. And so I was able to know what Fred and Rudi were going through at almost any given moment in the battle, partly through their own testimony, but also through the testimony of guys that were right next to them. And then there were other sources too. There were two chaplains, Chaplain Yamada and Chaplain Higuchi, who were a little older than the soldiers. They're 30 or so. They had wives at home, so they were writing detailed letters home almost every night describing what had happened that day. And those letters were really, really useful. Actually, my wife did most of the research on that and was enormously helpful.
Was there anything in particular that surprised you, Daniel? I mean, I suspect a lot of things surprised you, but can you think of one or two things that you really did not expect going into this project? What was it, 5 years ago when you embarked on this? Something that sort of, sprang out of the material.
I mean, I'm just going to be really frank and say that getting to know these guys broke a lot of stereotypes for me, like other white guys. Although I had many Asian friends growing up, we all walk around with certain stereotypes and assumptions in our minds because of our cultural upbringing. And even though I think I had a relatively sophisticated upbringing in the Bay Area, I still had my stereotypes. Getting to know these four young men, they were often old men by the time they told their stories to Densho. I got to know them on a much deeper, more human basis, and learned about their flaws and their idiosyncrasies and strengths and weaknesses. And it helped for me break down a lot of pre-existing stereotypes. And I'm hoping that readers will have the same experience. I think we all do better with dealing with the kinds of things that are happening right now in the world if we simply get to know other people on a very human basis. And that's really what I'm trying to do in this book.
Well, you do so very, very effectively, and I think one of the joys of the book is that the characters behind the names come alive so strongly as people, and really novelistically. I mean, the broad arcs of their stories are rendered quite beautifully. Let's sort of shift a little bit to some of the questions coming in from the audience, people who are watching us right now. And one question that seems to recur is what was going on the other coast? We associate the internment camps, and much of your book deals with the camps in the West. One of the camps in Arizona, where you describe in vivid detail the heat and the dust and the dryness and the cold water showers and then 24-hour lights. I mean, it's really a torture camp in many ways. But could you talk a little bit about the two coasts during that time period, Daniel?
Well, I have to be frank and say I don't know as much about the East Coast because almost all my sources were Hawaii and California. So you actually may know more than I do about what was happening on the East Coast in this context. It was one of the things that happened, though, was that in order to avoid the camps, or in order to continue their education at universities that if they had been going to Cal Berkeley or UCLA, they suddenly weren't able to. Some folks went east, either to the Midwest or all the way to the East Coast. So a lot of young people actually, some of the colleges and universities around the country deliberately opened their admissions to kids that had been enrolled at West Coast universities and enrolled them in their own institutions so they could continue their education. And then a lot of families just decided to move east. They were done with what had happened on the West Coast. So particularly Minnesota and in the Midwest, a lot of families sort of resettled in the Midwest. But that was hard. That's something that sounds like, okay, well, you just get up and go east and the problem is solved. And of course, it was nothing like that, because people had to leave behind virtually their whole lives that they had built for themselves. And they had to venture off to Ohio or wherever in the middle of World War II, when feelings were very intense and there was a lot of hostility. So as much as people understandably did not want to be in those camps, it was really a hard decision to say, well, we're just going to move east and that'll take care of the problem. It was much, much more difficult than that.
Yeah, and it was long before the internet as well, so there was no way to communicate really with people who were moving or were.
How were you going to get a job? Where were you going to live?
Yeah, exactly. I want to sort of shift it back to the material itself, which one of the reasons why I think this book is so important is there's just not that much material out there about these stories and these histories, both within the U.S. and overseas, of these soldiers and their families. On the one hand, is there anything you went to beyond the oral histories and the material that Densho obviously provided for you? Are there any texts that you would recommend? And also, I suppose a related question from the audience is this period and this experience in American history taught in American schools? And if not, why not? And should it be? I suppose a big questions, are there other texts that you would recommend? And is this material being taught in schools in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure any one title jumps out at me. There are a fair number of publications about sort of specific topics like the 442nd or a particular concentration camp. But I don't think there's much out there that tries to synthesize it in the way that I'm doing here with this book. I know that the subject was taught at least minimally in California. When I was a kid, we all read Farewell to Manzanar, which made a big impression on me. But when my kids were going to school, I don't recall this being a subject at all in their schooling, and they went to good schools on the West Coast. So there's certainly a need, and particularly given this sort of outburst of hate and revisionist history, there really is a deep need for young people to be made familiar with this story. I think part of what happened was that Nisei men and women, when they came out of the camps, they often didn't want to talk about it, even with their own children. And so the stories they didn't disappear, but they got buried under several layers or several decades of silence. And in many ways, they're just sort of reemerging now as Sansei and subsequent generations are more interested in delving back into that history. So I think there's real opportunity. The last of these, the 442 guys, the last of Nisei are passing away. And so now, and that's why Tom does what he does with Densho. Now is the time to capture these stories and this part of history. There is actually, there is going to be a young readers edition of this book coming out. I'm not sure when, about a year from now, I think.
And I was very happy to see that this book has already been picked up as for a film deal to be produced as a film in the near future. And of course, the book preceding this that you wrote, Boys in the Boat, was a bestseller, and also, as far as I know, is on deck to be made into a film as well, right? The Boys in the Boat. And sort of quick question about Shop, Daniel. How have you grown or changed or matured? I know it's not always a straight line, but as a writer, coming now on the heels of Boys in the Boat and entering this project again, as far as I know, 5 years ago, as a writer, how do you think you've matured or grown or developed through this project?
Yeah, I mean, I like to think that I'm getting to be a better writer, just sort of by practice. And I know I am, because if I look back at my now 4 books, I like the first book very much, but the last 2 have clearly been much better books. So you do just learn a lot of sort of small tricks of the trades from doing it, and I spend a lot of time actually studying other writers. I read a lot of narrative nonfiction. So I read somebody like Laura Hillenbrand or somebody like that writes the kind of thing that I do. And I literally study how she, for instance, begins a chapter and ends a chapter. And so I've learned to learn from others and from my own mistakes. I think it is a big part of it. As far as Hollywood goes, I've learned to be patient and slightly cynical, maybe. The Boys in the Boat has been on and off as a film for 7 or 8 years now. It is back on track again, and they are supposed to start shooting in April, but I'll believe it when I see it, basically. And this new book, yes, there's a young director, named Destin Daniel Creighton, who grew up on Maui, who is absolutely passionate about this story. So we are talking to him about adapting it as a series, actually. It's like an HBO kind of series. And I mean, Destin's just a great guy. He's one of the most empathetic filmmakers I've ever seen. He made a film recently called Just Mercy about a Black civil rights lawyer and a death penalty case that just really got to me. And so I'm really excited about what he might be able to do with this.
And a question that also came in from the audience, Daniel, is, are there any materials written by Japanese that you may have looked at or that you might recommend about the experience of the war? You know, in addition to obviously the oral histories and the diaries and the notes that you went through, can you think of anything from a Japanese artist or writer that you'd recommend?
I can't specifically in the area of history. Because I don't speak Japanese, I did have a number of documents translated. I had letters translated, which were very, very helpful. I think you mentioned that one of my characters, so to speak, Fumie Miho, without the war in Japan. And so her story was really interesting to me, but she was writing, she left a memoir, but she wrote it in English. So no, I'm sorry, I don't have any particular source to point to, but I obviously think it's always a good idea to understand a complex situation like this from both sides of the Pacific.
Fumie Miho actually, witnesses the bombing of Hiroshima in your book and her account of it. I know I could sort of advise or suggest works from the world of manga or Japanese graphic storytelling and animation. There's a manga called Barefoot Gen, which is the story of a boy in the aftermath of the bombing of Hiroshima, and an animated film made in Japan called Grave of the Fireflies, which actually I ended up discussing with Professor John W. Dower in Boston some years ago at the Museum of Fine Arts. We had a screening of Grave of the Fireflies and talked about the Japanese experience of World War II on the home front, which again, it was wonderful, Daniel, to see you address that in your book through Fumie's story, because it really broadens the entire scope of the book when you have not only the men on the front in Europe, but also the families at home in the camps in the United States, and then a Japanese woman abroad, experiencing the war in Japan.
Yeah, there is actually going to be a Japanese edition of this book, and I'm very curious to see, how well it does and how it's received. I don't know. Again, I don't know when that's being published. Probably about a year from now.
Wonderful. And towards the end of your book, there's this description of you taking a trip with your wife up a very hairy mountainside in northern Italy to sort of re-experience what the young men experienced as soldiers, scaling that mountain with, of course, in their case, tons of equipment on their back. And you describe it quite beautifully. It winds up being a nice, kind of a nice coda in the book. And also it's wonderful to see your wife brought into the story. And the mountain, of course, many, many, many decades later is quite beautiful and peaceful. I wondered if you want to talk about that experience personally as a writer, actually visiting these sites decades after all the strife that you write about. Yeah,
it was really, I was honored actually to be able to go on a tour of the battlefields that the 442 fought on. In this case, it was in Italy, and we went from one to another. So I was traveling with the sons and daughters of Nisei veterans, and it was very, very moving. We went to the American cemetery in Florence and found the graves of individual 442 guys that had fallen in Italy. And as I say, we we saw a lot of battlefields, and in some cases we met local. In one case, in one town, Tendala, there was a very old man there who, as I think, an 8-year-old boy, had witnessed the liberation of this town by the Nisei soldiers. And he got out in the street, and he didn't speak any English at all, but he pantomimed and explained through an interpreter how the Nisei had come into town, and how the battle had unfolded. And it was just amazing experience. So actually, I'm going to read a little passage when we're near the end here from my my tour of the battlefields.
What are you working on next, Daniel? Not that you've had time to breathe, but
Yeah,
what's next on your desk?
you know, so writing this book took almost 5.5 years, and I'm going to not work on anything for about a half a year.
Good for you.
Except, you know, I will be talking about this book and engaging with audiences about it. But I'm not sure what's next. These are huge research projects. So I try to be very careful before I embark on one, that it's something that I'm going to care about in my heart for 5 or 6 years, because you need to care about it for that long in order to stay engaged and see it through to the conclusion.
One question that came up for me as I was reading your book, and I'm very happy to hear you say that it will be translated into Japanese and published here in Japan, because I think it's a story that is not very well known at all among Japanese. And I wondered if you'd ever been to Japan yourself, Daniel, or if you have plans to come over here sometime in the near future.
I would love to come. I have not. Everybody in my family except me has been multiple times to Japan. I've always been too busy writing to go with them. But no, my wife and I actually have been talking about doing that maybe next year. We don't have any particular itinerary in mind, but would absolutely love to do that.
Do you read a lot of novels? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I do. I was an English major in college, and so, you know, I grew up reading novels all my life. I have sort of shifted over lately to reading the kind of thing I write, as I say, narrative nonfiction,
Sure.
because I enjoy it, but also because, as I mentioned, I learn a lot from reading other people who write the kinds of things that I do.
Thanks so much, Daniel. It's as I said at the outset, it's really a pleasure and an honor to be in conversation with you here for the groups in Boston. And congratulations and thanks again for a terrific book, a really important book.
Well, thank you, Roland. Thanks so much.
Thanks. Okay, Margaret.
We are receiving a tremendous amount of gratitude to you, Daniel, over the Q&A for bringing this story forward. Many folks have said they didn't know anything about it. And one woman mentioned that her daughter went off to college and had a roommate whose father was incarcerated, and she didn't know the story. And many of us don't know much about it. So thank you so much for that. Gratitude pouring in. You brought up such important topics: courage, breaking down stereotypes, very important for all of us, amazingly important topics now. So we do need to move toward closing, and I wish we could go on all night, but as Daniel mentioned, he does have a reading for us and also an image for us. So Daniel, right back to you.
Okay, thank you very much. As we were just saying, I had the opportunity in 2019 to tour the battlefields in Italy where the 442nd had fought. Very near the end of the war, they were asked to climb the backside of a mountain called Monte Folgorito in northern Italy. The Germans had established what was called the Gothic line, a defensive line along a series of mountaintops, and Folgorito was one of them. So the 442 was asked in the dark of night to climb several thousand feet up the backside of this mountain and to surprise the Germans at daylight, which they did. And they broke through the Gothic line, and really in many ways with that turned the the tide in that part of Italy. So I want to read a passage to you. When I was there, I had, as I sometimes do when I'm going to places I've written about, I had sort of an epiphany. This shows just the last few hundred meters of that mountain to the left side of this image. It falls away into a valley. And I want to read to you what was going through my head. I climbed up to the top. There's a little cross at the top of the mountain. I want to read to you what was going through my head as I stood at the top of the mountain. When we finally clambered onto the summit, I stood for a moment, just catching my breath. Then I looked around and I was stunned. Below me to the west, the mountain's green foothills tumbled down toward the brilliant turquoise expanse of the Ligurian Sea. To the southwest, I could see all the way to Livorno, to the north, all the way to the buff-colored cliffs of the Cinque Terre. To the northeast, the great spires of Monte Altissimo loomed above us like stony fangs. What really arrested my attention, though, was what lay between me and those peaks, a deep chasm, its abrupt sides cloaked in dark vegetation, dropping thousands of feet from where I stood at an angle of perhaps 60 degrees. At the bottom were red tile roofs of houses in what looked like a tiny toy village. The village was Ozzano, and it was out of that abyss that the Nice soldiers of the 442nd RCT had climbed in the middle of the night, 75 years before, lugging their weapons, prepared to fight and if need be to die. Standing there, I struggled to comprehend the sheer audacity of it, pondering what exactly enabled those young men to do something like that. But in almost the same instant, I knew the answer. It was something simple and powerful and irreducible. It was who they were at their cores. Those young men were the living embodiments of the spirit that has always animated America, the spirit that has held us together for more than 2 centuries. The striving, the yearning, the courage, the relentless optimism, the willingness to chip in and lend a hand, the fair-mindedness, the inclusiveness. They knew that they had been called upon to defend a set of simple but profound ideals, the highest ideals of America and the Western democracies. And having heard the call, they answered it, as did millions of young men in the first half of the 1940s. Most of them fought for those ideals on the battlefields. Some, like Gordon Hirabayashi, fought for them in courtrooms. But do not forget this: as American as they were, in some ways and to varying degrees, they were also proudly Japanese. As they stood up and ran into the fire, many of them carried with them values that their immigrant parents had taught them, not just the samurai's code of Bushido, but a host of related beliefs and attitudes, Giri and Ninjo and Gamen among them. Indeed, it was largely because they held these other foreign values that many of them were able to do what had to be done. On Monte Folgorito, in the Vosges forest, among the hills of Tuscany, at Monte Cassino, time and again, they selflessly offered up their best selves, and the selves they offered up, the lives they put on the line, grew from both American and Japanese roots. Whether they lived or died in the endeavor, they reminded us yet again that we Americans are all composed of varied stuff, a multitude of backgrounds and identities forged together in the furnace of our national tribulations and triumphs. In the end, they helped win for us a far better world than the one in which they found themselves when Japanese bombers first appeared over Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7th, 1941. Now, more than a generation later, it is up to us to cherish and protect what they won, to devote ourselves yet again to the principles they defended, to surmount our own mountains of troubles, to keep moving upward together on the long slope of our shared destiny.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for that. That was very powerful. Now it's time for us to move toward closing. But first, just a reminder that if you'd like a copy of Facing the Mountain, please visit our partners for this talk, Porter Square Books. The information is in the chat.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you so much for the book. Thank you, Daniel and Roland. That was a beautiful conversation. It really touched, I think, a lot of our souls. Daniel, you mentioned your work is to get to know people on a human basis. That's exactly what we do. And as I say this, I would invite everybody, please visit our website at www.japansocietyboston.org. We are very blessed to have Roland Kelts will be sending us a letter from Tokyo every month. And the first letter is up on our web right now.
Thank you, Yuko. And to the Japan Society of Boston, to find out about resources and services, book lists, and more, as well as upcoming programs for all ages at the Boston Public Library, please visit us at bpl.org. And you can see a few of the upcoming programs here on this slide.
We at American Ancestors NEHGS are delighted to have been part of tonight's presentation. And we encourage you that if you find yourself doing historical research about your family or someone else's, or simply studying America's history, you might find our library and education center to be of use. Our stacks on Newbury Street are currently closed because of the pandemic, but they will be opening in late June, and more conveniently, anytime you can visit our digital archives, anytime. Connect with one of our genealogists online at americanancestors.org or join in an educational program. We hope you'll join us again. From all of us tonight, all of the partners, many thanks. Thank you, Daniel and Roland. We so appreciate your account and your insight into this really important time in America's history. And to all of you in the audience, thank you for joining us. Good night from those of us in Massachusetts, from Washington State, and Roland, thank you from Tokyo. We hope you have a wonderful day over there, and a good night to all of us. Thank you.